and welcome back to the second part of The World this week, where four journalists join me in the studio to talk about what's been making headlines in the last 7 days. Today it's the turn of Christopher DICKEY, the foreign editor at the Daily Beast, Jean-Marc, a former France 2 correspondent, Elena, a journalist with the Russian service at our sister radio network RFI, and fellow Australian, albeit like me, based here in Paris, Marc BURLEIGH, a journalist with Agence France Presse. And thanks to all of you for giving me some of your valuable time. And you, the viewer that is, can also contribute to the discussion. Our Twitter hashtag is TWTW. And given how those historical events 70 years ago shaped the Europe we now know, there's hope that D-Day diplomacy might ease the crisis in Ukraine. We even saw Russian leader Vladimir Putin shake hands with the Ukrainian President-elect Petro Poroshenko, with both men calling for an end to the bloodshed in eastern Ukraine. And in the meantime, French President François Hollande have met with both US President Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin at separate meetings in Paris on Thursday. He was hoping to use the occasion to nudge the Russian leader into a rapprochement with Kiev. And a meeting of the G7 industrial powers in Brussels on Wednesday urged Putin to recognise Poroshenko as Ukraine's legitimate leader. Still, they warned Russia of tougher sanctions unless it halted provocations inside its troubled neighbour.
Russia needs to recognize that President-elect Poroshenko is the legitimately elected leader of Ukraine and engage the government in Kiev. Given its influence over the militants in Ukraine, Russia continues to have a responsibility to convince them to end their violence, lay down their weapons, and enter into a dialogue with the Ukrainian government. On the other hand, if Russia's provocations continue, it's clear from our discussions here that the G7 nations are ready to impose additional costs on Russia.
And Putin may have shaken the hands of Poroshenko, but the Russian leader was holding firm, as we saw in an interview with French television earlier this week.
The United States policy isn't a secret. For a long time, it's been the country that's carried out the most aggressive and toughest international policy in order to protect its own interests, according to its leaders. We have almost no military presence abroad. Meanwhile, the American army bases are everywhere across the entire planet. And wherever they are, they decide about the fate of other people, thousands of kilometers from their borders.
Christopher, D-Day was successful. It led to the collapse of the Nazis, but it also led to the East-West divide, as we were talking about just before the break, that still exists to this very day.
Well, I think that Putin has done a lot to restore it recently. I think it's pretty clear that Putin would like to reestablish something like, if not the Soviet Empire, the old Russian Empire. I think he feels very uncomfortable having Ukraine be just a separate country. I think he'd like to bring a lot of these places back into the fold. And I would say that we probably should look at maps from the late 19th century rather than maps of the Soviet Empire to get an idea of what he really wants. In Ukraine, he's talking about Novorossiya all the time, which is something from the 19th century. And I think that he's figured out a way to do it, because he's figured out a way to basically carry out covert actions and warfare that don't trigger the kinds of Western responses that would be really damaging to him. Sanctions, yes, but not wars. NATO is not going to go to war for the Ukraine. And in fact, nobody's even talking about Crimea. Do you hear Obama? He says, if he gets worse, then we'll do something more. Not if he doesn't give Crimea back. He's never giving Crimea back, and everybody knows it.
If you think Putin's got a grand strategy, though, part of it is to keep Ukraine and large chunks of Eastern Europe out of the hands of the EU and NATO, particularly. What we've been seeing from the Ukraine crisis is that Obama is very specifically bolstering NATO in the countries that are NATO members,
yeah,
which
but
isn't
there's
Ukraine.
But you know, the media, we are very fickle. We're barely covering Eastern Ukraine. We're barely covering Eastern Ukraine right now, and the war there is much worse than it has been at any point in this crisis. A lot more people are getting killed every day than ever before. The rebels have opened up a corridor to Russia. They've basically ended border controls so that they can get all the supplies they need. And while all that is going on, then Putin is talking stability in Normandy. It's really interesting.
Yes.
I think he's very good.
Jean-Marc.
Yes, that is true. And this is why Putin is, I think, such a great tactician. But at the same time, you had one incident where those unidentified non-Russian soldiers who happened to be extremely well trained, extremely well armed, and I mean you could see the way they held their weapons, that they were professionals, which is not exactly the reputation of the Ukrainian army, but for a fistful of special forces. Then suddenly these guys decided they were going to restore order in one place where the locals, the pro-Russian locals, had started going beyond being pro-Russian and into banditry and pilfering and things like that. So suddenly you had the impression that not only the Russians were there to counter the Ukrainian government, but also to restore the order that they had disrupted themselves.
Elena, you have both Putin and Poroshenko calling for an end to the bloodshed today. Is this just a tactic by Putin to distance himself from the separatists?
I mean, I was not sure what's going on. I mean, for the moment, I'm not ready to say that we saw history changing, even if we wish to, because if we compare it to the interview Putin gave once again with a French journalist, he says there is no pro-Russian, there is normal people, civilians who are fed up what's going on, there is corrupted regime and everything. And so we know how much efforts François Hollande did for this meeting to happen, and Angela Merkel as well. So let's see what's going to be next.
Mark, do you think that Poroshenko is now going to call off the Ukrainian military campaign as a result of this meeting today?
No, I don't. But going back to eastern Ukraine, I was in Ukraine for about a month just recently, and from what I see, it's not really monolithic. There are certainly Russian-sponsored forces that are very professional, but you also get a sort of warlordism that is emerging around Slavyansk, around other towns and cities there. You know, I'm sort of thinking maybe Putin's tripped off something that he can't fully control, and this is right on his border.
But that's fine with him, because what he wants to do is weaken the Ukraine.
Exactly.
He wants to destabilize it. He doesn't, and he doesn't want to be responsible for it. This is the genius of the policy.
He's got this customs union that he keeps going on about, and now his actions have pulled Ukraine out of possibly ever doing that.
Jean-Marc...
and also, perhaps I should add that a number of people, at the beginning, looking at eastern Ukraine from here, we would imagine that the whole of the region had decided to join the so-called pro-Russian forces. But actually, a lot of people do not want to get into that, because they realize that law and order are just breaking up, and there's such a heavy dependence on Ukraine, including eastern Ukraine, on Russia, that, I mean, if business doesn't work, very simply, aside from political expediency, I mean, the whole country is breaking down. And a lot of people I read in eastern Ukraine are not at all following the pro-Russian forces because they think there's too much trouble.
It's difficult to take it back to a political thing, because Ukraine is essentially run by economic barons, of which Poroshenko is one of them. It's not really coming up through the ranks, grassroots political stuff like we're used to in the West. This is run by economic barons, and now we're seeing in the East, it's now got military barons running it. So, you can only sort of see a splintered arrangement coming out of this.
So where do you think this leaves the US as a result, Mark?
I think what we're seeing, I'd love to know, what is it, a 10, 15-minute talk between Putin and Obama today. I'd love to know what they talked about, because it's all about leverage on both sides. And I go back to what I think is Putin really doesn't want permanent NATO military bases in the East. I think we're now on the track to perhaps seeing something set up in Poland or something like this. Really what he doesn't want. This is how you hurt Putin. It's not anything you can do in Ukraine. That'll be dribbling around the edges. I think the NATO thing.
I mean, Obama's position really has to be pretty much like my father's first sergeant in the Army, who said to him, "We can't make you do nothing, but we can make you wish you had." And that is exactly what they need to do with Putin. And that's what they're trying to do. That's what Obama's trying to do. The problem is that the United States just doesn't have a hell of a lot of credibility anymore, because it is so clear that there's not going to be any military option. that Putin can keep pushing. If he gets a setback, if it gets a little too chaotic in eastern Ukraine, he can pull back, he can recalculate. He has a lot of flexibility and a lot of room to maneuver. The West doesn't.
Elena, do you think that Putin is just being very coy at the moment, or that he's genuinely wanting to sort of ease things off, to cool the temperature a little bit?
I think so. With Putin, you can never be sure about the future. As a French actor said, even we cannot be sure about the past already. With President Putin. So, and also I'm very interested about the discussion between President Obama and Vladimir Putin. And of course, once again, in Russian media, state Russian media, we discussed how weak President Obama is on Syrian issues. And I don't know if you read Izvestia yesterday, when they was writing about meeting with Obama and Poroshenko, who is the chief of chocolate.
The chocolate king.
Yeah, chocolate king, and they told these two chocolate presidents met. Can you imagine? Poroshenko and Obama. It's Izvestia journal. So. And they was laughing about Obama making gym because everybody saw Vladimir Putin naked with his muscles, and that's a level.
Well, I think that more than trying to find out what Putin wants to do, it's more important to look at what he wants to achieve. And he's played bad guy. At the moment, he's playing nice guy, but the aim is the same. As my colleague said from AFP, no more American bases close to Russia, you see. So the negotiation, as I see it, will not take place within Ukraine, but much more behind the scenes between the Americans and NATO and the Russians. Because, for example, pleasing the Poles by putting a new American base in Poland would certainly be considered quite a casus belli by the Russians. That's not what they want, you see. So I think the American force, the way American forces are deployed, or NATO forces are deployed in Europe, is the real problem, is the real aim of Putin. And the second one being, of course, domestic policy, because it makes him very popular to show his way around.
Christopher.
Well, there's not going to be a casus belli with Russia because Russia cannot touch the United States in terms of conventional weapons. There's also, in terms of economic warfare, eventually, it doesn't happen overnight, the U.S. and Europe will be able to crush the Russian economy if they want to, particularly if Europe begins to wean itself off of Russian energy.
That's a big if.
Well, it is a big if, but it's far from an impossibility.
They had their opportunity and they weren't going to take it.
Yes, I was talking about a political casus belli. Of course not, war.
No, not of course not war, because that's the bottom line. Are you ready to go to war? And Russia's not ready to go to war. Russia's army is a disaster. Of course, it doesn't help that the French are about to sell them more ships.
Unfortunately, yes.
And President Hollande has been pitching himself during these D-Day celebrations as a mediator, hasn't he, Jean-Marc?
Well, you know, any president who is organizing a big world-class party will try to solve a problem and try to get some political leverage from it, especially a president who is as weakened as President Hollande is at the moment, you see.
Do you think he's gained any traction as a result of doing that?
Oh, I don't think so, because you see, foreign policy is not the problem. As you know, this is not the problem. If Putin were able to give us to solve our unemployment problems, perhaps we'd deal something with him, you see. But nobody's going to bring this to us. Hollande is quite alone.
Mark, Putin is still pointing the finger towards Washington as saying the Americans are the aggressor in all of this.
Oh, I actually admire the way the guy talks on camera. I think he's very good. He's got his propaganda is very strong. It's a lot more wily than the old Soviet days, and I think he can score some points with it. But no, overall, I think when you go over it, when you're over there and when you're on the ground and when you're in the halls of power around here, it's fairly clear that he was behind the unrest that happened in East Ukraine that is still going on. It's the nature of it is changing a little bit now, but he's certainly the chess player on the other side of the table.
And he's really ruling. Even this interview with El Kabash, who is for French is a star of journalism, and we saw Vladimir Putin just put him back on his chair, and he was very tough on journalists. Sometimes he was not smiling. Just 4 times he smiled, I think.
Yes,
I just kind of.
He played the old trick that in the time the Soviets always play. They would come to France and say, "Oh, the French, we respect you. You know, General de Gaulle, independence from the United States." I mean, this is the old trick. I'm afraid it did work on that interview, and they should have been more protective.
Okay, we're going to have to move on, and the political woes of the French Conservative opposition UMP continues. Allies of former President Nicolas Sarkozy are now calling for his return to head the party, which of course has been beset by crisis. The UMP has been hit by a campaign funding scandal that's forced its chief to step down and set off a leadership contest, thus setting the stage for a comeback that could propel Sarkozy to a re-election bid in 2017.
In this country, I don't think that we have that many experienced, competent politicians with authority. And yes, my choice, which is well known, isn't something new, it's no revelation. Naturally, I hope that he engages fully in public life.
Recycling of old politicians is not a trend confined to just France, Jean-Marc, but do you think he'll be able to rally the troops if indeed he is going to go down the path?
You know, it's too early to say. What Sarkozy is a champion of the blitzkrieg, and he has correctly perceived that the big problem in France at the moment, at the time when the 2 main political parties have been grossly defeated by the extreme right, that the first problem is a problem of leadership. And he may not be as competent as he thinks he is, but he has the capacity to mobilize. He's a good talker. He has some charisma. At the moment, Sarkozy is the most popular man with the party machine, not with the militants, because they feel they have been pilfered of the money they contributed to pay for the missing amounts of money that Sarkozy had not paid for.
But, Christopher, is the tide turning in his favour?
Well, what kind of tide are we talking about? It's really kind of like a little washing of the sea, because the UMP is falling apart. I mean, essentially the Front National, or Marine Le Pen, she's going to eat a large part of the UMP. His success in politics, in presidential politics, was contingent on him eating the National Front in the past. That's how he did it. He got National Front voters to come to him because somehow Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of Marine Le Pen, was just unacceptable. But she's not unacceptable, and she is going to cause the UMP enormous problems. Is he going to go to the right of Marine Le Pen now? No. Is he going to be convincing as a centrist? No. Is he going to have credibility as an honest, upstanding politician? Hell no.
Oh, no.
So who is this guy now? I mean, I like Sarkozy. He's charming. He's great copy. But I don't think that ultimately the French people will buy it.
And that's what I want to ask you, Mark. What do you think the French public are thinking about all this?
I think 2017 is a long, long way away in politics. This will be largely forgotten. The socialists have pulled it out and, of course, waved it around, but will have been moved well past there. But Sarkozy does have to step up now to save the UMP. He's facing off against 3 prime ministers who don't like him very much, who have taken it over and who are going to be aiming for a primary, which he is absolutely dead against an ex-president standing for a primary, as he says. So I think he has to step forward in some way. Probably his smartest move, if he's able to do it, is some sort of proxy. But as we've seen, one speaking there, he may have to do it himself. But like Jean-Marc said, he's the master of blitzkrieg. I think it'll all come down to the last few months before the election rather than what's happening today.
But he had to act now because there was an opportunity, and he is that kind of political warrior, not to miss an opportunity when there's one. However, as my colleague said, it's a long way over to the elections, and also the enormous, the size of the political scandal where the money of the UMP was allegedly embezzled, there was massive fraud, and it all benefited a certain candidate named Sarkozy.
There are many cases.
This is automatically going to flash over his head.
Can he run from jail? That's the question.
Do you think he's going to emerge unscathed, though? I mean,
impossible. I can't imagine this, because the militants, not the opposition.
When you say militants,
his own militants, the UMP who voted, supporters, the UMP supporters felt they had been robbed. They contributed to paying to the missing money in the party, and then they realized it's all been embezzled.
But at the end of the day, yeah, but politics is a cynical business, and if this is a man who keeps, gaining more and more support out there in the French public, wouldn't they be willing to sort of, forego their concerns?
You see, the issue of corruption, as in many other countries, is paramount today because there's so much unemployment. And you see, if the opposition came only from political rivals, if opposition came only from other parties, but the opposition to Sarkozy comes from his own supporters, and that's pretty serious. And so the people that are pushing him forward at the moment are probably, I would say, there are people trying to save their political future, but it's an enormous gamble.
Elena, is there anyone else in the UMP that we should be keeping an eye on as a potential leader?
Russia keep an eye on François Picard and Nicolas Sarkozy, of course, but also I was very, very surprised to see the result of the election, because there is new people who are voting for far right, for Marine Le Pen, students and people who never would give their attention to such a kind of person. And what is important, people voted not for François Hollande in 2012, but against Sarkozy, and I'm not sure that they're ready to go back.
You know who could win the popular vote? The popular vote would be Christine Lagarde, I think.
And do you think she stands a chance?
I do not. Not necessarily because she was involved or allegedly involved in some political hanky-panky. It was the so-called tapis affair, but perhaps because she's too...
bidding.
Yes, because perhaps she's too bourgeois. Now, the man to watch, in my opinion, is former Prime Minister Alain Juppé, who's also a defense minister,
foreign
minister, and at the moment he appears to be the quiet pro on the sidelines, and that is
also an ex-convict.
Well, but
you can't have everything, Christopher.
Well, I don't want to be picky, but
and
not as bad as the others.
And somebody who's been paying close attention about what's been happening here on the French political scene is my colleague, Nicholas Rushworth, who's been running the Media Watch desk in the absence of James Creedon. And so what have you got for us, Nicholas? You've been looking at the social media. We, of course, were talking about D-Day earlier in the program, and from what you were telling me earlier today, there's been actually very little social traffic about D-Day.
Well, I suppose that reflects a generation gap, doesn't it? But let's go straight away to this picture here. There, a big thank you to those guys for those D-Day landings 70 years ago. There you can see that extraordinary picture, and that's very much the message you're getting in the traditional media, the full coverage of all those events 70 years ago. Now, very few things on the social media, as you mentioned there, Annette, but what we've got here is this fantastic idea of why don't we all get involved here and do some retweeting ourselves for those amazing veterans. So I retweeted this myself, about 3 or 4 days ago. At that point, there were only a couple of thousand people retweeting. Now it's over 8,000. So please do retweet that.
Because the likelihood of them having Twitter handles is extremely unlikely.
Very good point. Look at this. This is an initiative in France here from people in Caen, the town that was mainly destroyed in northern France. And you can see a fictional character, Louis Castel, and he is tweeting live. There you can see every few seconds, 70 years on the whole events in French and in English. So it's a brilliant way, really, to capture the flavour of the blow-by-blow events that they went through during the landing 70 years ago. So extraordinary moment, of course.
And of course, one of the important guests at these ceremonies was Queen Elizabeth, who's 88. Had a very busy week. She certainly didn't look like lacking any energy as I saw her on screen earlier today.
Well, of course, she had a bad week in some respects, perhaps going a little bit better now. But look at this. King Juan Carlos decided to abdicate on the day of the 61st anniversary of her coronation. So, of course, was that kind of little subtle messaging to her? Of course, there have been demonstrations against King Juan Carlos in Spain. Look at this in The Guardian. We've got a headline, should, after King Juan Carlos deciding to abdicate? Should the Queen of England go? And the result, if we scroll down, is very split. You can see that vote is closed, and we've got 50-50 people in England saying that they should keep her or not. Of course, the Queen herself, she's dining tonight in the Elysee Palace, and there is a satirical Twitter handle for her, Elizabeth Windsor. There you can see. I've just nipped over to France to remind everybody, including Hollande, who's the boss. And so, of course, she's 88, as you said. She's not going to quit, is she? There you can see one tweet there saying, well, if I do abdicate, it won't be for Charles, it'll be for the corgis, and we can see those corgis, perhaps which one will get the job?
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank Nicholas Rushworth for summing up what's been happening out there in cyberspace, and also I want to thank my guests, Christopher DICKEY, Mark BURLEIGH, Jean-Marc ILLOUZ and Elena SERVETTAZ for being such wonderful guests here on this edition of The World This Week. François Picard will be back in the chair on Monday. Do stay tuned in the meantime here on France 24 for more news and headlines.